the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College.
Welcome to the Wade Center podcast. This is Crystal Downing, and I'm joined by David Downing, my co-director at the Marion E. Wade Center, as well as our producer, Aaron Hill. And today we're going to talk about two essays based on presentations that C.S. Lewis made to the Socratic Club in Oxford. So, David, why don't you explain what the Socratic Club is?
The Socratic Club was founded in December 1941 by Stella Aldwinckle. She was a chaplain at Oxford University. They have an Oxford pastorate that goes back to the 1890s.
Oh, wow.
To serve undergraduate and graduate students. Everything in England goes back about 100 years farther than you expect.
Yeah, it is interesting when you go to different parts of the world and you realize how much older things are there.
Right. In California, they have, quality air conditioning since 1999. You go, wow, that's historic. You should get a blue plaque put on your truck. Anyway, it was founded in Stella Aldwinckle. A student said, Christians and non-Christians around here don't really interact. They just, the Christians all have this view of non-Christians. The non-Christians have this view. She said, we need a forum for people to get together. And Lewis loved the idea. So Stella Aldwinckle, he was a fascinating person. People often talk about Lewis being a man's man and not interacting well with women, but she's one of the women that he really got along with, and together they kept the Socratic Club going from 41 until it didn't disband until 1972.
Wow.
But it was a real weekly event in Oxford in the 40s and early 50s before Lewis went to Cambridge.
Oh, well, like it was like a big deal?
Yeah, every Monday night for like an hour and a half, they would have like a famous atheist, A.J. Ayer or Anthony Flew or J.B.S. Haldane come and explain why they weren't a Christian. And then Lewis would typically get up and do a spontaneous rebuttal or refutation or interaction. And it was like quite the show.
Yeah, it was like really a weekly boxing match.
Yeah, it was.
Lewis and an atheist.
And he loved debate. And so, in fact, he actually intimidated some of these figures. They say that J.B.S. Haldane, who may be the antecedent or the model for Weston in the Ransom trilogy.
Oh, really?
He came and gave his speech on Marxism and why Christianity wasn't true.
Mm-hmm.
And then he got up and left before Lewis got a chance to reply.
Nice.
That's the story.
There you go. That's a good strategy.
But some of the other atheists who showed up later in life, C.E.M. Joad and A.J. Ayer, became Christians.
Oh, wow.
So it's interesting, but it was just very intellectually stimulating. It was a lot of fun. There was tendency to have goodwill on both sides.
Yeah.
When they founded the club, Lewis wrote the founding of the Oxford Socratic Club. And he wrote, in any fairly large and talkative community, such as a university, there's always the danger that those who think alike should gravitate together into coteries where they will henceforth encounter opposition only in the emasculated form of rumor that the outsiders say thus and thus. That doesn't sound at all like today's world, does it? Things are so different now from Oxford in the 40s. The absent are easily refuted, complacent dogmatism thrives, and differences of opinion are embittered by group hostility. Each group hears not the best, but the worst that the other groups can say. In the Socratic Club, all this has changed. Here a man could get a case for Christianity without all the paraphernalia and the irrelevant, there's a word, sansculottism, which means without pants. Sorry. Literally it does. Sansculottism.
Oh, the French revolutionaries, people talked about them in their culottes.
Are you serious?
That's probably a reference.
You're not joking.
I'm not joking.
Really.
Okay, it sounds like Winnie the Pooh's philosophy or something.
I don't know.
Anyway, he says, at the very least, we help to civilize one another. So that was his commentary on the Oxford Socratic Club.
Right.
And both our essays we're going to discuss today come from presentations he made to this lively debating society, or just a place to air ideas that was very popular in Oxford. And it would have been so exciting to go once a week, go hear C.S. Lewis talk to all these other great minds.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Before we start discussing these two essays, I want to do a shout out to one of the researchers who has spent time at the Wade, a philosophy professor at Boise State University named James Stockton, who specializes in retrieving and preserving the minutes from the
Oh.
Socratic
Yeah,
Club.
yeah.
And he also teaches a course on C.S. Lewis at Boise State. So I actually reached out to him when I was writing an essay on Lewis's response to Reinhold Niebuhr. And he helped me assess whether Lewis had been at a meeting where there was
Yeah.
a presentation on Niebuhr. So his work is very valuable. Now, the first essay we're going to talk about must have been written soon after Stella Aldwinckle started the organization, because this was presented in 1941, that in that first year,
Oh, wow.
and it's called Bulverism. And David, why don't you explain what Lewis means by the word he made up, Bulverism?
Well, Bulver is the idea is there's a character who never interacts with your ideas. They just say, "Oh, you just say that because you're a Christian." I had this happen to me at UCLA. A professor was saying, "Well, Athanasius was one of the early heretics in the Christian church," and I said, "No, he was not a heretic. He was Orthodox. The Athanasian Creed was." And the professor said, "Oh, you're just defending him because you're a Christian." And I wanted to say, "That's an example, sir, of Bulverism."
Right. Right, because he's just accusing you without any empirical evidence or reason.
Well, that's why Lewis is upset about it. That's why he's critiquing it. You've got the drift there. Good job.
He invents this fictional character. He calls him Ezekiel Bulver. And he
Yes.
says that he's going to write an imaginary biography about him. The example he gives is he heard at the age of 5, when he heard his mother say to his father, who had been maintaining that two sides of a triangle were together greater than the third, "Oh, you say that because you are a man." And then he goes, that sort of sets his thing. And he defines it. He says, "Assume that your opponent is wrong, and then explain his error, and the world will be at your feet. Attempt to prove that he is wrong, or worse still, try to find out whether he is wrong, and the national dynamism of the age will thrust you to the wall." And so he's arguing that essentially you can disprove. It's sort of a genetic fallacy. It's like you can disprove what somebody believes because you can say, "Well, you think that, David, because you are a baby boomer."
Yeah, that's exactly true. I think the word I would use would be ad hominem. When
Okay.
Right.
You often say, "Oh, the reason you're against immigration is because you're racist." And you say, "No, I have these other reasons why I think the border," and it's impossible to refute ad hominem. One time I tried to introduce a film course at a college, and people said, "Oh, you just want to use your class time showing movies." And I wanted to say, "No, my soul is pure. I don't need to teach the course. I just think that film is an important narrative art form in the 20th century."
Right. And that students need to learn how to intelligently watch film than just passively couch potato them.
Yeah.
Right. But the problem with ad hominem is there's no way to you can't
Right.
you can't say, "Take an X-ray of my soul, see how pure it is. My motives are good."
Well, why didn't he just say ad hominem, which is one of the ancient...
I think he did it because ad hominem is derogatory and it's usually toward one person.
Oh.
And I think his real targets here are Marxists and Freudians
Oh, definitely.
who say, "Oh, well, the only reason you're a Christian is because you want a perfect God in heaven who's much better than the human God or the human father that you had, a perfect father in heaven."
Right, right.
Or the Marxists would say, "Oh, you're just trying to defend bourgeois class interests." And so I think the reason he chose a different term is entire classes of people are being dismissed because either they're bundles of complexes or else they're class interest.
Yeah.
And the obvious reply is, well, why don't you have complexes or class interest?
Yeah.
What causes you to
Yeah.
critique these things?
Well, he's also talking about, and he gestures towards it about philosophy has been dealing with this problem for 2 centuries. When he says that, he's gesturing towards Kant and Descartes and what we would call like philosophical idealism. And so he's setting it up. He's saying philosophers have been dealing with what you would call like subjectivism, which is this idea that we only experience the world through sensations or phenomenon, and so we're sort of everything we think is subject, to something else. Descartes stops at "I think, therefore I am," so there's like a foundation for him. So you just kind of start from this perspective of questioning everything, and he's saying, this has been going on in the background, and you see it manifested in empiricism, where it's like we can't believe something unless we can measure it,
right?
And then as Jerry likes to say, well, can you measure that belief? And Lewis kind of brings that up in the article. So I think there's this element of like, what is the origin? Where does it come from? Is if we can explain the cause of your thought, then we can invalidate whether it's right or wrong, essentially.
Right. And it's impossible to defend yourself because that's not rational. That's psychological.
Yeah.
So you can't come back with a logical argument because they've already got you pinned to the wall because of your psychology or your class interest.
I actually quote from this essay in my book on postmodernism and how important it is to Christianity. And I reiterate this, that Lewis would have loved postmodernism because it was making the exact same attack on Freudianism and Marxism that Lewis makes. And here's the part I quote: Freudianism and Marxism are as much systems of thought as Christian theology or philosophical idealism, which you just brought up, Aaron. The Freudian and the Marxian are in the same boat with all the rest of us and cannot criticize us from the outside. They have sawn off the branch that they are sitting on. And that's a very postmodern insight that people develop models where they take presuppositions on faith, but then they accuse Christians, oh, well, you just kind of believe these things on faith. Well, they are doing the exact same thing. And what's interesting is that now psychologists look back on Freud and recognize a lot of problems with what he invented. In fact, I heard one psychologist actually say that Freud was one of the most brilliant fiction writers of the 20th century or the 19th, early 20th century.
Wow.
Because they have discovered evidence that when he would do an experiment and it didn't turn out the way he thought it would,
oh no,
he would actually write it up and he said, well, this is what should have happened.
Of course, yeah.
Because he had these presuppositions. Yeah. And in the 1930s, there were people who were starting to question even the economic basis of Marxianism. And a famous thinker named Antonio Gramsci in Italy, who was arguing, no, it's just you can't designate everything as having economic causes. That the way we think are signifiers that are disseminated throughout culture.
Yeah.
One of Lewis's lifelong enemies was reductionism. And both Freudianism and Marxism are very reductionistic.
Yeah.
Oh, you think that way because the class you belong to, or you think that way because of your neurotic complexes.
Right.
There's a good book by Paul Vitz, V-I-T-Z, where he actually examines the personal lives of all the famous atheists, going back to Voltaire and Diderot and coming forward to Freud. And what's amazing is they all had extremely vexed relationships with their own fathers. And so he was saying, if you're going to psychoanalyze people of faith, why not psychoanalyze critics of faith? And you'll find plenty of material to show that their ideas are driven by their own personal prejudices or their personal wounds.
But even that could be Bulverism in less.
Could be, yes.
And what Lewis is saying is that you have to start by analyzing the quality of the argument first.
Yeah, whether it's right or wrong.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. He says there's two questions that come up. The first is, are all thoughts thus tainted at the source or only some? And then the second is, does the taint invalidate the tainted thought in the sense of making it untrue or not? And so then he goes on to say, the only line that we can really take is that some thoughts are tainted and others are not. Which has the advantage of being what every sane man has always believed. But if that is so, we must then ask how you find out which are tainted and which are not. So he's saying, we're back to where we started, which is we've got to figure out if it's a right thought first.
And you can see why, since this presentation was made early in the Socratic Club, he's essentially providing a paradigm for the whole club, saying, let's address each other's arguments rather than bulverize them.
Right.
Well, and I think Lewis is trying to set up inference or reason, logic in and of itself, as something that's self-evidently true, and that's the thing that we agree on.
Right. Well, he does say in that quote I read, we help to civilize each other.
Yeah.
The whole idea of a forum for civil debate and witty debate, you have these famous pairs like Chesterton and Shaw, and William F. Buckley would have the firing line debates, and he would get on there with John Maynard Keynes, and it was so entertaining, but it was so civil because they were both being very articulate, very knowledgeable, but very respectful of the other side. We've really lost that. We need a new Socratic club.
Yeah.
Right.
You see that when he says later on in the essay or the talk, he says, the forces discrediting reason themselves depend on reasoning. You must reason even to Bulverize. You are trying to prove that all proofs are invalid. If you fail, you fail. If you succeed, then you fail even more.
Right.
So he's saying ultimately we have to have a foundation of reasoning and inference and logic. Otherwise, we can't have these discussions with each other because you'll just say, well, you believe that because you're a Christian, and I'll say, well, you believe that because you're an atheist, and then why did we
and
even
the
show up?
conversation
Yeah, exactly.
ends.
You know,
Right.
I'm going to start. You just believe that because you have freckles. I'm going to start really messing with people's minds. Wait a minute. What does it have to do with?
he says, if our inferences do not give a genuine insight into reality, then we can know nothing.
Right.
Right.
All beliefs have causes, but we have to distinguish between the causes, and then ultimately we have to ask whether they're true or not.
Right. And that gets him in something that is reiterated through so much of his writing, that if someone is going to appeal to reason or appeal to goodness, even if they're anti-Christian, if they're an atheist, most atheists will say that Hitler's extermination of the Jews was evil.
Mm-hmm.
But how we would respond to that atheist is that, well, where are you getting your standard of good versus evil?
Yeah.
That you have to have some source of goodness beyond your particular logic, especially if you just appeal to a utilitarian ethic, which is the greatest good for the greatest number. Well, that's what Hitler was doing, greatest good for greatest number.
Yeah.
If you appeal to evolutionary progressivism, that's what Hitler was appealing to. They were very motivated by Darwin's cousin who explored eugenics. You know, you purify the race. That's part of the evolutionary process.
Well, I think the form this takes now is everything is a social construction. And when you say Hitler committed genocide in the Holocaust, you say, no, that's absolute evil. That's metaphysical evil. The idea of a social construction, I think, comes from languages. The Germans say Hund and we say dog, and neither one of them is right, neither one of them is wrong. They're both social constructions. But when you say, our culture, we're against genocide, it's stronger than that. And so I think you're right that we need to ask an atheist or an agnostic, why was the Holocaust wrong? Why is that metaphysically evil?
Right. Yes, and get them to develop an argument.
Yeah, and sometimes they will fall back when it comes to this discussion of foundationalism and philosophical idealism. Sometimes they'll come back to saying, well, that belief is true for a certain group of people at a certain time. And so that's kind of their fallback position. And then you can't really argue with that because you could say, well, I mean, I guess the Nazis did believe that, but then that then that doesn't give you the ability to distinguish whether something is true between cultures. It sort of isolates truth, and that what we've done is we've taken that to the highest extreme, which is the individual. So you get to decide what's true for you,
right?
Yeah. So it started out as there are these things that are true for everyone. Lewis would call that the Tao, and then it fell back to, well, it's true for certain people in a certain time in a certain way, and now it's fallen back to, well, it's true for me. So that's all that matters is this. We'll say things like, this is my truth and stuff like that. And then what that does is it puts you in a situation where, in the past you couldn't say, well, the Nazis were wrong for doing this or that because that was right in their culture at that time. And that's a big problem, right?
Right.
If we can't condemn the actions of Hitler, that's a problem. But then it leads to now where it's like, if I can't say that what you do or the belief that you hold is wrong, because if the standard we set is, well, that if you believe it's true, then it's true for you, then we're in a big, that's a big pickle, because we can't have discussions and disagree.
Wow, such strong language, Aaron.
Yeah.
Well, Chesterton addressed this 80 years ago. He said, people say, well, this is just my philosophy. This works for me. And he says a cosmic philosophy has to fill the cosmos. It can't just fill one person's head. And you're right. We're hearing more about my truth and your truth.
Yeah.
To me, a middle case would be sauerkraut.
What?
Is that just a cultural habit of eating that, or is that intrinsically evil? So I don't know. I have mixed feelings about sauerkraut.
Yeah.
Well, the decade after Lewis wrote Bulverism, he wrote a book called The Discarded Image. And it was basically an introduction to medieval and Renaissance literature. But he is reflecting what we're talking about here. And he says, and once again, I quote this in my postmodernism book because this is what postmodernists say, in every age, the human mind is deeply influenced by the accepted model of the universe. We can no longer dismiss the change of models, like from the pre-modern to the modern, as a simple progress from error to truth. No model is a catalog of ultimate realities, and none is a mere fantasy. Each is a serious attempt to get in all the phenomena known at a given period, and each succeeds in getting in a great many. But also, no less surely, each reflects the prevalent psychology of an age almost as much as it reflects the state of that age's knowledge. And that is a truth that needs to be pronounced more often to counterbalance this current, well, it's true for me. This is my truth.
Yeah.
And that's so naive to think that you aren't influenced by your particular culture, models of thinking of your time.
Yeah, I wanted to mention on this topic, there's a series of notes that Lewis produced for the Socratic Club that were published in volume 37 of the journal that the Wade Center produces, which is called Seven. And so in volume 37, it's called Notes on the Nature of Reason. So it's somebody discovered notes that Lewis put together for a Socratic Club talk. They didn't get printed into an essay like this, but he goes through and he talks about sort of his theory of reason and how we reason and the differences between different types of reason. It's interesting, very technical discussion, but Lewis, it's clear that he thought about this a lot, and he saw reasoning and inference and logic as the way for us to resolve these disputes.
There's an old book by John Henry Newman, Cardinal Newman, called The Grammar of Assent. And he tries to rate levels of certainty from 2 + 2 = 4 all the way to I believe my mother loves me.
Yeah.
And he says a lot of Christian faith is based on a convergence of evidences.
Mm-hmm.
We're not as certain of Christian faith as we are that the sun will come up tomorrow, but we're not absolutely certain the sun will come up tomorrow.
Yeah.
The earth may get hit by an asteroid in the middle of the night. So it's kind of fascinating. Christian thinkers have been thinking about this a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What is the nature of assent and how much of it can be based upon logic, how much on evidences, and how much there is faith. You have to extend yourself beyond the evidence to have a solid worldview, a stable worldview.
What I love about Lewis is he points out this idea that like we can only take skepticism so far, and then like he said, like you mentioned, Crystal, there comes a point where you saw off the branch that you're sitting on.
I wonder if Sayers was influenced by Lewis's involvement in the Socratic Club because she helped start a similar organization in London. The Socratic Club was in Oxford, and there was a church that helped sponsor it in London, and it was called St. Anne's. And the same type of thing, bringing Christians and agnostics and atheists together in the same room to have civil conversations with each other. And isn't it sad that in the 1940s and 50s, that was happening much more than today when discourse has become so polarized and words have become so weaponized.
Yeah.
T.S. Eliot was very involved in St. Anne's. Somebody should do a history of St. Anne's. There's a lot of really important figures involved, but there aren't that many records. But a great book would be St. Anne's and the Socratic Club. I mean, a kind of a Christian model of interacting with non-Christians about matters
David,
of faith.
That's your next project.
No,
I'm just co-author it. I'll do St. Anne's, you do Socratic.
Oh, maybe we should do that. Yeah. I'm offering these to our audience, and all I ask for is a 10% finder's fee. If you write the book and get a contract,
this is true. You guys have put some really good book ideas for it on the podcast.
Well, let's move to the next essay. Now, this one was delivered 21 years later, and yet still has some similar themes. It's called Is Theism Important? And what is significant about this essay, which was published in 1962 in the Socratic Digest, he is responding to agnostic, sounds more like an atheist, who also titled his talk, Is Theism Important? And it is an interesting person that he was responding to. I think the person was arguing that theism is not important because he was an Oxford University professor named H.H. Price, but he was a specialist in psychical research. So he was a philosopher of perception, but he got super into parapsychology. And this is fascinating because he wanted to suggest that, yes, there's an afterlife, but he didn't want to accept a Christian view of an afterlife.
Oh.
So he came up with this. He was president of the Society for Psychical Research, which gets into parapsychology, before he even gave this talk that Lewis responded to. And he said the afterlife is made up of memories from your real life, and that your self, your dead self, can actually draw upon memories of your previous physical existence to create totally new images. Like you could create your own heaven. And each person will experience then a world of their own because it's based on memories. But you can communicate with other people through dream telepathy.
Oh, okay. All right.
And he's saying Christians take too much on faith?
I know.
He's basing this on,
empirical evidence?
I would say you could trace that back to subjectivism, Kantian subjectivist idea that sort of the world is only the phenomena and the perceptions that come to our brain.
Very modernist.
Yeah.
This whole modernist emphasis on autonomy.
Yeah.
So even my heaven is autonomous. I create it from my own memories.
Well, the extreme of that is something called solipsism, where you arrive at this idea that, well, the world is just purely something that's happening in my mind, and the outside world is, like everything is a part of what's happening in my mind. So Crystal and David don't really exist. This is a podcast that I have inside my own mind. Crystal and David are not real. They're just a fiction of my own.
Well, Price actually didn't want to be accused of solipsism, and that's why he predicated this idea of dream telepathy, that actually the dreams are kind of roiling around in what he called the psychic ether.
Oh.
And that's where ghosts come from.
Wow.
Okay, all right.
This is an Oxford University professor in the and he started suggesting this in the 40s, but, still into the 60s.
Wow.
This was his big thing. And if you're interested, I just got information about it just off of Wikipedia.
Wow, that's
so
really
just
cool.
enter H.H. Price and you can
Now,
read.
is it true or not? You haven't made it clear whether
I was going to say.
Well, there's a big movement going back to
Did he invent proton packs as well? Who are you going to call?
In the 1880s and 90s, there's the Society for Psychical Research. And their idea was we want to explore the spiritual realm using empirical methods. So we want to document telepathy. We want to document prescience, foresight. And they sort of wanted a faith in the spiritual world that was based on empirical evidence, not on revelation.
Yes.
Well, the trouble is you have to take all their evidence on faith.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
It's never convincing.
Well, Arthur Conan Doyle, who invented Sherlock Holmes, and of course Sherlock Holmes is all about analyzing the empirical data. But Arthur Conan Doyle got super into psychic research, and there was actually a show at one of the New York City museums that I went to where we have photographs that Doyle took where he said that he was photographing ghosts.
Oh, yeah.
And I know Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the poet, she went to seances. They thought of seances as scientific.
Yeah.
Because you would get evidence of dead people coming back to speak to you.
Well, this is where, like, going back to like the Victorian and the 1800s, you had sort of the rise of spiritualism,
Right.
in England, and essentially had this disconnecting of sort of a Christian afterlife view, but then you just gets focused on just communicating with spirits in the afterlife, and they're taking spiritualism and putting it together with science to kind of come up with this new field of research, quote unquote. I'm putting that in air quotes so you can't see. Research.
Well, there was an article in the Christian Scholars Review. They have a weekly blog, and this fellow from Biola was talking about near-death experiences or life after life experiences. And it is interesting. This woman is in surgery. She dies in surgery, but then she's resuscitated. And she says, "Why is there a blue sneaker on the window ledge, 3 floors up?" And they go, "What are you talking about, a blue sneaker?" And they went and checked, and sure enough, somebody had left a tennis shoe on the window ledge 3 floors above the surgical room. Yeah, the outside ledge.
Wow.
And they said you couldn't see it from the ground, and she'd never been above the operating. He gives a number of stories like that seem to suggest that consciousness isn't necessarily anchored in the brain or brain activity.
Wow.
I don't know what to make of those, and I think you can definitely go weird places when you start getting into life after death.
And H.H. Price would love that example, but then that explains the tactic that C.S. Lewis uses in his response to Price, this parapsychologist. Is Theism Important? Because he says there are 2 different kinds of faith.
Yeah.
And there's faith A, and he essentially says faith when it's defined sheerly in terms of belief in God differs little from faith in nature, faith in consciousness,
of other
faith
people.
In parapsychology, faith in the psychic ether.
You make me think. I feel that crystal does exist, but Aaron, I'm not sure about you. You're giving me second thoughts about external reality. I wanted to go back to the faith A and faith B. When I read God in the Dock first time in college, this was super helpful for me because I was raised to think that faith is faith. And you believe that God is in heaven with the same assurance that you believe that the Statue of Liberty is in New York Harbor. And if you said, well, this is the problem of evil, they would kind of say, well, you're showing your lack of faith. You're showing your doubt.
Yeah.
And I felt, they would say faith, hope, and love, the greatest of these is love. I had a friend who grew up fundamentalist and said, in my family, the greatest of these was faith. It wasn't expressions of love. It was very much, do you believe?
Yeah.
And just this, I remember reading this exact essay in college and going, well, faith is faith. It's not the same. A Christian worldview is not the same of believing that the Eiffel Tower is in Paris. And so that's what got me off on this idea of convergence of evidences or levels of assent.
Right.
Yeah. Well, you can take it a level further with the fundamentalists, and there's a faith C, which is the faith in your faith.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
That's
the level
true.
of the strength of the level of faith that you have in your faith itself becomes, that's where you get those altar calls where it's like, are you sure that you're sure that you're sure?
Right.
Yeah, right.
Well, which is why Dorothy Sayers in her radio plays Man Born to Be King, she made the real sin of Judas his certitude. He believed his own perception of Jesus more than he trusted Jesus, which gets us exactly to faith B, and we haven't talked about that.
What is faith B according to Lewis?
Faith, and I never made this connection because we know that starting in 1943, C.S. Lewis read Dorothy Sayers' radio plays about Jesus every year for his Easter devotions until he died.
Oh, wow.
And I bet he was influenced by Sayers' showing that Judas had faith, but he had what Aaron said, he had more faith in his interpretation of Jesus than he had faith B, which C.S. Lewis defines as trust. That is trusting the gift of God made manifest in Jesus Christ, and that importance then of trusting it enough to accept the gift.
Yeah.
And what that does, it turns faith away from, well, I have faith in myself. I have faith in my own faith.
Yeah.
And it puts the faith is your trust in Jesus Christ is the word of God.
Yeah.
And that's the essence of Christianity.
Yeah. He says faith B, he says it's more like our confidence in a friend. It's not necessarily certitude in the sense of like, I'm sure that David will always do X. It's just having faith that, well, I know David pretty well, so I have faith that he will do X.
Right.
Right. It's interesting that Lewis points out that faith A is the faith that is described in the New Testament about the demons. He says the devils have faith A, they believe and tremble, and they have faith A. A man who curses or ignores God may have faith A.
Yes.
So there's a level of assent of, I believe that God exists, but do you trust him?
Yeah.
In other words, do you trust him? Do you trust your fate to his hands or to Jesus? Or do you just believe that he exists?
Right. And he's basically saying, hey, you, Price, who don't think theism is important, you have faith A.
Yeah.
You have total faith in the psychic ether from which people create their own heavens.
Yeah. He also ties this to paganism, and he talks about paganism. Can we talk about what he's saying there? I didn't realize that Price was coming at it from this psychic perspective, but it makes sense why he would bring up the paganism versus...
David, why don't you talk about his C.S. Lewis's interest in paganism?
Well, we were talking earlier about this article he wrote about a Christmas sermon for pagans.
Yeah.
People often, when they hear the word pagan, they think, oh, they're wild, they're partiers, they don't believe anything. But Lewis always used the term to mean the classical world, the pre-Christian world. And he sees pagans as people who are actually longing for greater revelation. They have ideals, they have a sense of their own moral failings, and they're kind of waiting for Christianity to come along. He says the difference between the classical pagans and modern skeptics is the difference between the virgin and the divorcee. It's one thing you're waiting to embrace a relationship, and it's versus those who have rejected a relationship.
Yeah. You mentioned that Christmas sermon for pagans. So, just for listeners out there, that's printed in volume 34 of 7. It was originally printed in The Strand magazine in December 1946.
Okay.
And the paper shortage that they had back then, they printed it on low-quality paper. So it's almost impossible to get a copy of this essay unless you get a copy of 7 in which it's printed. But I just wanted to read a couple things there. He says, a heathen meant a man who lived out in the heath, out in the wilds. A pagan meant a man who lived in a pagus or a small village. Both words, in fact, meant rustic or yokel. So he's sort of saying a pagan back then just meant somebody who lived in these remote regions, sort of a non-converted, uneducated, pre-Christian person. But then he gives another example. He says, the unmarried girl. But then he also says, or a street where the houses have been knocked down. It's not the same as a field where no house has yet been built. The ruined street and the unbuilt field are alike in one respect, namely that neither will keep you dry if it rains. But they are different in every other respect. Rubble, dust, broken bottles, old bedsteads, and stray cats are very different from grass, thyme, clover, buttercups, and a lark singing overhead. And so he argues in that essay that actually it would be a good thing if Britain became pagan again, because
in the original sense of the
original sense,
word.
because there would be a belief in the supernatural that would make it much easier to then lead them to faith that a supernatural God sent his son, to be a sacrifice for us, as opposed to post-Christians, which is actually what Britain was becoming, was post-Christian.
I'm glad that Lewis included cats in the part that's devastated and desolated. I'm not a cat fancier, so I'm glad he added
Sayers
that
and
detail.
Lewis exchanged letters about cats. So,
well, can I mention something else from the essay? So he brings up Rudolf Otto. We've talked about him a lot in here, and one of the things he tries to draw together in terms of this sort of pagan foundational belief is this idea of the numinous, of the holy, and the encounter that you have, it creates a feeling in you. And he tries to argue in here that, we have to believe that it's more than just a feeling or a fear. It's not just sensations, that there's something behind it. And he says, we have the word awe, an emotion very like fear, with the important difference that it need imply no estimate of danger. When we fear a tiger, we fear that it may kill us. When we fear a ghost, well, we just fear the ghost, not this or that mischief which it may do to us. And so he's trying to tie into Otto's thing and saying these numinous experiences that we have are telling us that there is this supernatural layer to reality. And Price isn't wrong about that. It's just he's wrong in what he's placing his faith in.
Right.
The faith B or the faith A that he has.
Right.
Lewis had a strong belief in general revelation. He said even before people became Christians, they have the numinous experiences, the sense of awe, and being exposed to some higher power.
Yeah.
They
and
also
pagans have that sense of the
right.
numinous.
And Rudolf Otto actually catalogs those. Lewis mentions Otto a lot in The Problem of Pain, which I was talking about yesterday. Lewis also believes we have the moral law that regardless of what culture you're in, there's something like the 10 Commandments that tend to come up. And he actually catalogs
the abolition of man that we've talked about.
Yeah.
He has an appendix. Another one is Sehnsucht, this feeling of longing, this inconsolable longing that somehow we were meant for paradise, but we've been cast out.
Yeah.
And it's painful, but it's pleasurable. And and then I would throw in dying God myths. He felt like world mythologies show the need for redemption from above. We can't fix ourselves. God needs to intervene. So he had a strong feeling that pagans already had a lot of clues that were making them receptive to Judeo-Christian revelation.
And then in this essay, Is Theism Important? He then builds on this dying God myth to say also the sense of historical verification.
Right.
So, and this is what he got from Tolkien, and this was key to his own conversion to Christianity, that yes, there are all these dying God myths, but in Christianity, it happened in history. Myth became historical fact. And so you can appeal to history. And then he also says, and you also appeal to philosophical argument, which is like what he was saying in the first essay, Bulverism, that if you can't create a reasonable argument, that is a problem. But finally, and this is key to faith B, is an act of will.
Yeah.
I will to recognize the convergence of the moral law, the numinous, Sehnsucht, historical verification of an actual death and resurrection.
Yeah.
He philosophical argument, but then I have to will to trust the origin of this.
Yeah, he says religious experience in the narrower sense comes and goes, meaning, we don't really have any control over whether we're going to have these numerous experiences or not. The operation of faith is to retain, so far as the will and intellect are concerned, what is irresistible and obvious during the moments of special grace.
I like that. You left out a phrase. He says that religious experience comes and goes, mostly goes.
Yeah, especially goes,
Yeah, there's a lot of time in between. Another essay that we didn't address directly, he has a great essay called The Obstinacy of Belief. And most people use the word obstinate negatively. You're being stubborn.
Yeah.
But he means it to mean steadfastness. And he says when you're in a period of spiritual exploration, you're really open to, is this true or is it not true? But when your intellect brings you to a point of faith, part of what you understand is that religious emotions come and go, especially go. He says we're amphibians, we're spirits, but we're also physical beings. And if you're depressed, if you're sick, there's a lot of peaks and troughs. And part of what you understand as a person of faith is not to build your faith upon how you're feeling or whether or not you're feeling very excited about your faith, depressed about your faith.
Yeah.
Does God seem close? Does God seem distant? And so by the obstinacy of belief, he means belief that's based in the will, not based upon the emotions or the kind of passing peaks and troughs that we all experience.
Yeah. To tie it back to the Bolverism article, at the end of that discussion, it kind of transitions into somebody taking notes of what Lewis says. So it's kind of interesting. It gets transitioned to like the third person. Mr. Lewis went on to say, but he makes a point here. He says, in all other ages, the plain man has accepted the findings of the mystics and the philosophers for his initial belief in the existence of the supernatural. Today, the ordinary man is forced to carry that burden himself. And he goes on to say that a society consisting solely of plain men must end in disaster. If we are to survive, we must either believe the seers or scale those heights ourselves. So he makes the argument in Bolverism that the problem that we run into is in ages past, we would trust what seers or mystics or people, St. John's, Dark Night, we would trust those experiences that they had and say, oh, well, I believe that because you had this experience or because of what's written in, St. Paul's experience on the road to Damascus, since I believe that can form a basis for the supernatural, even if I haven't had one of those experiences in my own life. But if we turn it around and we say, well, you have to have that experience in your own life in order to believe there's something supernatural, then everybody has to become a seer. Everybody has to have that experience. Otherwise, you can't have faith in anything. And he kind of sets that up as like a tyranny that we put on ordinary men, that it's, they don't have the time and we don't have the resources to, go out into nature and have these transcendental experiences ourselves.
He brought that up in the essay we discussed last session. He said that when he talked to the RAF personnel, they didn't believe in authority. They felt like, well, I haven't experienced that.
Yeah.
And they also didn't believe that if something happened a long time ago, it was relevant to us today.
Yeah.
So you've got a double obstacle there to saying we do take things on authority. He says in Mere Christianity, I'd never been to New York City, but I take it on authority it exists. People I know have visited it. I've seen pictures of it. And so he said people are excessively skeptical when they hear something. They have to take something on authority. Most of what we know is on authority. It's not on firsthand experience.
Well, and that's another problem with the modernism that both Lewis and Sayers were combating, because it was so predicated on a model. Once again, Lewis talking in the discarded image, everybody operates by a model, and modernist model was progressivism. That evolution is just reinforcing this view that we are becoming more and more intellectually sophisticated, that Christianity was part of the superstitious model of the past.
Yeah.
And it's that idea of progressivism that Lewis and Sayers and other Christians and postmodernists were fighting.
Yeah. People in the past had to rely on experts, but today we can figure all that stuff out for ourselves.
Right.
And you go,
and we can enter the psychic ether.
Yeah. Yeah. You're like, do you really understand how your car works? You probably don't. So yeah, it's like David said, we rely on experts in a lot of areas of life. But I would say that's a very persistent virus, I think, that's infecting not just our own personal thought, but our society as a whole, is this lack of trust in experts.
Yes.
But when
definitely.
people look to an expert, it's like Oprah or, Whoopi Goldberg. Like, what do they have to think? You go, really? These are our influences? These are our public intellectuals?
Yeah.
I long for the days when you could listen to A.J. Ayer and C.S. Lewis debate philosophical issues rather than Whoopi Goldberg defends, Joy Behar against Sean Hannity. And I go, really? These are the people we're listening to now?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, when everyone is their own expert, then everyone thinks their opinion is, equally valid,
Right.
And
I like what you said. Everyone is their own export, too.
Sorry.
You export your
good.
ideas.
Yeah, it's like both these essays, part of the reason I chose them is they were so helpful to me. I had such a naive view of faith when I was growing up, and such an oppressive view of faith. And to have doubts was to be spiritually weak. And Lewis gives such a liberating and more sophisticated understanding of what faith is and how it works, and what things we can put faith in and what things we don't have to put faith in. So it was important for me to overcome a crisis of faith by realizing it wasn't my actual faith that was in crisis. It was the way people were defining faith in my life.
Yeah.
So these are two of my favorite essays from my own spiritual formation.
Well,
It's interesting that Lewis did that for you and George MacDonald did that for him. Do you remember that great quotation from MacDonald about doubt?
Yeah, he says, doubts are messages from the living God to the honest soul.
Yes. And just the freedom, it's okay to doubt. In fact, trust means that you continue trusting even when you have doubts.
Yeah.
That is faith B, as Lewis puts it.
But it's also helpful, I think Lewis talks about in these essays, is helpful for us because we do live, if we're being honest, we live in an increasingly post-Christian age.
Yes.
We live on the street that is the ruins of Christianity, and with the cats running about and the disused bed mattresses and stuff like that. But if we want to find our way back to some level of faith, then we have to sort of step back and go, well, what can we agree on? What can we base our faith on? And Lewis is saying, you still have the power of reasoning. You still have the power of inference and logic. You still can weigh whether or not a claim that somebody is making is true or not, or if there's a confluence of evidence or something like that, so that you don't have
authority and tradition. You don't have to reinvent epistemology in your own life.
So that you don't have to turn into Rene Descartes and say, well, I guess the only thing I conclude is I think, therefore I am.
Yeah.
Right. Last thoughts, Crystal? I've seen a lily push its way up through the stubborn sod. People always want more music from me. I keep hearing.
Is that what they say?
I believe in miracles.
I find that hard to believe.
Touche.
Speaking of belief.
Yes, touche.
Goodbye, all.
Yeah,
I think
thanks,
we better
guys.
stop now.
All right.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.